Chapter 21. Jim pulled up the hood of his parka, for the temperature had dropped far below freezing in the night. The wind came in screaming gusts out of the north, so that he had to lean forward into it as he pulled along down the lake. Before he had moved an hour, the first chill of the flakes of snow began to sting his face. "Come on, you, Bruno," he called back sharply. There were still 18 miles to go if they were to reach the cabin at the foot of Squaw Lake. Jim could have turned back, but it would mean the loss of a day or more. Except for a few well-marked portages, it was all lake and river trail. They could not get lost, even in a blinding blizzard. He decided to go on. 5 minutes later, the air was so full of snow that the trees on the shore had become a distinct shadow. Then, even they were gone, and there was nothing around the moving sled but a blank of whirling white. They fought their way forward through the narrows and bore to the east down Grave Lake. The wind was bearing from the left now, and Jim kept his bearings by the sting of it on his left cheek. He looked back and found Bruno right at his heels. The big lead dog gave a soft whimper. "What's the matter, boy?" Jim said, and stopped to see if the harness was chafing. He could feel Bruno's body trembling under his hand. Paddy was cowering between the traces, his ears cocked back, listening. Then Jim heard it. A faint sound, half lost in the bluster of the wind. The quivering, sorrowful call of a hunting wolf. It was behind them, he thought, and on their trail. Close, too, to be heard in the teeth of that storm. Being followed by wolves was nothing new in his experience. He got his rifle off the sled. Maybe there'd be a chance for a shot if the snow slacked. He made sure the magazine was full and tucked the rifle under his arm, still in his deerskin sheath. "Come on now, mush," he growled to the dogs. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Several times in the next half hour he heard that howling again. Or was it his imagination playing tricks on him? Once he turned quickly and thought he saw a grey ghost shape vanish in the veil of white behind him. Impossible. He knew he couldn't see 50 yards in such snow, and no wolf would come that close. Yet he could have sworn he saw something move back there. Jim checked an involuntary shiver and swung forward into the storm again. Angrily, he refused to glance behind, even when Bruno whined and shouldered close to his knee. Then, suddenly, a dark wall loomed right ahead. A narrow wooded point not a dozen paces away. In the few seconds it took to pull to the left and round the spur of the trees, an idea came to Jim. He turned sharply and seized Bruno's collar and jerked the team after him into the woods. Then he sprang back to the end of the point. Breathless, he snatched the rifle out of its cover and crouched there waiting. The wind was blowing right across the lake now, not back along the trail. Neither scent nor sound would betray his ambush. Still, wolves were weary brutes. He waited those seconds that seemed like hours, while the blood pounded in his ears and his fingers shook against the trigger guard. Why this tension had come on him he did not understand, nor did he try. It was there, a weird feeling of something strange and terrifying. He eased his cramped knees and waited. One moment there was nothing before his eyes but swirling eddies of white. The next he was staring at a grey moving outline, so near that he trembled, so monstrous that his heart missed a beat. This was the big wolf. Jim never remembered taking aim, but he knew that at the instant he pressed the trigger, the huge beast had sensed his presence. The wolf checked, lifted its head, then as the bullet crashed home, it leapt straight upward. Exultant, the boy got to his feet. The heart shot. Animals struck in the heart always went into the air. A grouse would tower the same way, but he rubbed his eyes and looked again. Where was the furry heap he expected to see laying there? The wolf was gone. Jim started forward, shaken. It was a scant 10 yards to the place where the grey brute had been. 10 yards! Could he have missed? There was no blood in the snow, nothing but those tremendous tracks as big as a human's hand, blurred already by the sifting flakes. He looked about stupidly, and his eye chanced to light on a depression a few feet away to the north. More tracks. The wolf had started upwind, going at frenzied leaps, and Jim ran after. At the third set of footprints he found a great gout of crimson staining the snow. The distance between the jumps shortened. The boy slowed his headlong pace and moved along more cautiously. There was something uncanny about this pursuit, the sleet whipping blindly into his eyes, and he could see only a few snowshoe lengths ahead. Somewhere in that white fury, no telling how far, the biggest timber wolf in Canada was wounded, perhaps waiting for him. He clutched his rifle tight and went on, a step at a time. As minute after minute passed, a chill of fear ran down his spine. He knew what the Indians would say. You couldn't kill a witch wolf. Yet he was sure the animal had been mortally hit, and there was constant evidence of the blood-soaked trail. It was neither sight nor sound, but a sort of sixth sense that warned him the wolf was at hand. He halted and raised his rifle, his eyes straining into the flying snow. A slow stride forward, then another. There came a momentary lull in the storm, and a low grey mass took shape ahead. The wolf was crouching, facing him. He saw the flattened ears, the great bloody jaws, the lips writhing back in a terrible silent snarl. He fired just as a new flurry of flakes swept down, but before his view was blotted out, the mighty head fell forward in the snow. Jim was shaking all over when he reached the dead wolf. His second bullet he found had smashed through the skull squarely between the eyes. The first had drilled a hole back of the shoulder and must have pierced both lungs. But what a wolf! He stretched it out as best he could and measured the length from tip to tail. It was much longer than his snowshoes, nearly 10 feet overall. When he gripped the hind legs and hoisted them over his shoulder, the huge gaunt body was so heavy he staggered under it. Partly carrying, partly dragging his load, he made his way back to the sled. The dogs were still huddled in the lee of the point, out of the wind. They began barking furiously when Jim appeared with his grisly burden. Even after he had flung the carcass down in the snow, they kept their distance. The fur stood in stiff ridges along their back, and they growled steadily, deep in their throat. The boy paid no attention to them. He had a job to do, and lost no time in setting about it. If there had not already been a heavy load on the toboggan, he would have waited till he reached camp to skin the great wolf. As it was, he knew they would have enough trouble making it through the howling storm. He lashed the hind paws to a couple of stout branches and whet his hunting knife and made his first cut on the inner side of the haunch. Behind him the dog's growls turned suddenly to excited barking. He was in a hurry and did not look around. "Hi there, youngster," rumbled a deep voice over his shoulder. Jim's jump was almost as high as the wounded wolf had been. Startled, he whirled to stare up at the face of a furred parka. The man was only a pace or two away, and through the haze of flying snow he looked gigantic. As soon as he recovered from his shock of surprise, Jim recognized the newcomer. "Sergeant McLeish," he gasped. The man nodded and came a stride nearer. "So you got him," he commented. "Good day, what a brute. Wish I had the luck myself. Good grief, look at the size of him." He lifted the huge grinning head and fingered the 2-inch tusks with respect. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Jim Vanderbeck, eh? You trap this country?" "My brother and I," Jim replied. "He's gone over to Wabinger." "So that was his track," nodded the big policeman. "They told me in Akina I'd get to Wabinger if I followed you boys. I picked the wrong trail and came along after you when you separated back there. Don't know as I'm sorry after that, though, he mused. Were you after the big wolf, too? Jim asked in some awe. Yeah, said McLeish. If I found him, that is. He shot a keen look at the boy's face. Have you heard any of this Indian talk around Nakina? Jim nodded soberly. Then you know what I'm here for, the sergeant said. You can see why getting rid of this wolf is important. The rest of my job is over there at the Cree's camp. If I can get there before the track Indians start anything, I'll stop the trouble, of course, and if I had the wolf's hide to show them, that'll knock those fool notions out of their head for good. Want any help with that skinning? I guess not, said Jim. I'll try and make a decent job of it. He went to work with his knife again, and in 20 minutes the carcass was stripped. He rolled up the pelt in silence and held out the bulky bundle to the policeman. McLeish shook his head. That's a valuable skin, and it's yours. I've no dogs here, just this pack of mine on my snowshoes. I'd like you to come with me. Could we make Waubing before dark? Jim considered it. There was two possible ways. One was to go down Squaw Lake into the teeth of the storm, then strike over the hills to the north bay of Waba. The other was to head directly across, pick up Lindsay's trail that he had broken over the Long Carry. Yeah, he answered after a moment. We can cut south through the bush here. Maybe tough going, but I think we can do it. He lashed the wolf pelt on top of his loaded toboggan and gave Bruno a friendly cuff. Come on now, he said. You got some real mushing to do now, hup boy. With that he plowed ahead into the bush, axe in hand, and the tall sergeant followed the sled. Once or twice before in his life, Jim had hiked across this same stretch of country. He knew its difficulties in a general way, but finding a path for the toboggan was far different from going through alone. Again and again he spent precious minutes chopping away bush and fallen trees that barred the trail. At other times he made wide detours to avoid such tangle as appeared impassable. He had no compass. If his companion carried one, the boy did not ask to see it. The storm was all he needed to give him his direction, and he knew he was on the right line as long as the wind beat at his back. Hours passed. It must be well past noon, though the grey, snow-filled air gave no hint of the time. They crossed a ridge of rocky hills and stumbled down the other side through beech and poplar wood. A frozen pond opened out before them as they reached the foot of the ridge. Jim halted and peered out into the empty darkness. I can't see that far shore clear enough to be sure, he said, but we ought to be what we call Third Lake, just above the Long Carry. Wait here a bit while I scout ahead. A moment later he shouted he had found Lindsay's trail. When McLeish and the dogs joined him, he plowed along swiftly in the blurred furrow left by his brother's sled. From here on it was easier going. He knew the road so well he could almost have followed it blindfolded. They struggled up the high hill portage, pulling the sled to help the dogs, and once on the other side there was only open lake between them and Joe Leake's cabin. Jim was leading the way out of the cove from the head of Waubing when he checked suddenly and stared off down the lake into the dim white of eddying flakes. When McLeish reached him, he pointed to fresh snowshoe tracks coming in from the south. 6 or 8 men, he said soberly. Must have cut across country from Ojibwe settlement below Nakina. The big Scot knelt and examined the tracks and then stood quickly erect. Come on, he snapped. We have no time to lose. They can't be more than a quarter of an hour ahead of us. He jumped into the lead, and his long legs setting in such a pace that Jim and the dogs panted in their effort to keep up. The boy marveled at the strides he took, comparing those with the other snowshoe marks that had gone before. They must be gaining, and yet, as mile after mile went by, there was still no sign of moving figures in the blur of white ahead. The north bay of the lake opened dimly on their left, and the snow came howling down its length with staggering force. Jim lunged forward to take the policeman's side. Look, he screamed through the wind. They turned into the bay. Want to sneak up on the cabin through the woods, I guess. We'll go quicker if we stay on the lake. McLeish nodded and then hurried on. The many snowshoe prints were gone now, and only Lindsay's sled trail stretched ahead of them. At last Jim pointed to the shore. "Over there," he said. "I can't see the shack in the snow, but that's the place." The sergeant swung without a word towards the dark haze of the woods. His rifle was still in its sheath as he raced across the last stretch of snow-covered ice and up the bank. Jim urged on the dogs, and they were not far behind him. "Stay here," ordered the big Mountie. He went past the cabin and on into the bush. The boy looked about him uneasily. Except for the wail of the wind, all was silent around the Cree shack. Not even the usual yapping of dogs came from the somber log walls. The naked, shriveled carcass of a fox hung in a birch tree and swung there hideously like an omen of evil. He had no idea how long he waited, but it must have been more than a quarter of an hour, for his tired muscles were beginning to stiffen in the cold. Then Bruno lifted his head and whined a little. Several figures appeared at the edge of the tiny clearing. They came past the cabin and stood in a sheepish huddle near the shack. They were Indians, Ojibways from the track. Jim recognized one or two of their faces. Behind them stalked the giant police sergeant. He faced the group, looking at each one with grim deliberation. When at last he spoke, his words fell slowly with a cold cutting edge to them. "You men have been making big fools of yourself about nothing. I'm going to prove it to you." In 2 strides he reached the sled and seized the rolled up wolf pelt. "Look," he commanded. In his mittened hand the enormous skin unfolded, and he held it high in front of him. The grey brush trailed on the ground. "Tell me, is this the big wolf?" A chorus of astonished grunts answered him. One of the Indians stepped forward timidly and touched the huge bloody head. "Yes," he muttered in fear. "You see," demanded McLeish, "the big wolf is dead. This boy killed him, and you, who come here with guns to make trouble, do you know you're breaking the law of the Dominion?" His deep voice rumbled the word like thunder, and the Indians were shaken in their moccasins. Jim heard the faint creak of a leather hinge behind him. Turning quickly, he saw the cabin door was opened and closed again. Joe Leek was standing there with a rifle gripped in his hands, a look of fear and hatred on his face. He made no sound, but the sergeant saw the eyes of the Indian shift and glance over his shoulder. "Put that gun down," he said sternly. The Cree hesitated a second, then obeyed. "Is your name Joe Leek?" asked McLeish. The Indian nodded slowly. "Tell your woman to come out. Tell her not to be afraid. I'm here to take care of you." At the words he pulled back the opening of his parka so the red tunic showed underneath. The Cree stared, awestruck, then shook his head. "Woman gone," he croaked. "Where? Tell me, where'd she go?" "No tell," the Indian answered with a shrug of his shoulder. "Take 'em dogs, small papoose, go last night." There was suspicion muttered among the Ojibways, but McLeish silenced them with a hard glance. He left off questioning the Cree and took a long step towards them. "Listen to me," he said harshly, "and remember what I tell you now. You broke the law, but for this one time I will not punish you. Go home to Nikina, tell your people you are fools. Tell them you've seen the skin of the big wolf. He'll trouble you no more, and you will make no more trouble. Now go!" As he snapped out the last words, they turned with hanging heads and left the clearing. Silently, in single file, they took the trail up the lake. "All right, Joe Leek," said McLeish. "They won't be coming back again. Tell me," he asked curiously, "your wife's in there, isn't she?" The Indian's face was stubbornly set. He shook his head. "Woman gone," was all he would say. "Okay," frowned the policeman. "Have it your way. You don't seem much worried about her, though." He turned to Jim. "Well, boy," he smiled, "many thanks. Where are you camping tonight? It'll be getting dusk pretty soon, and I don't feel much like hiking back to town." You don't have to, Jim grinned. My folks live right down the lake a couple miles. I know they'd be glad to put you up. He roused the tired dogs and led the way out on the ice. The snow had practically stopped falling now, and the wind had slacked in force. They stayed in the lee of the wooded shore and plodded along through drifts a foot or more in depth. The sergeant pulled up abreast to his guide. Sorry that woman wasn't around, he mused. I wanted to show him that witch idea was so much tomrot. Now I suppose they'll say her spirit departed when you shot the wolf or something of the kind. He chuckled as he said it, but the words sent a shiver through Jim. Gosh, he shuddered. I sure would hate to think that. Well, don't let it worry you, laughed the big Mountie. There was a light in the window of the cabin when they pulled into the home cove. Jim cupped his mitten's hand and sent a long halloo echoing through the clearing. Dogs began to bark in the kennels, and Pat and Bruno gave a deep-tongued answer. Lindsay's broad shoulders appeared in the doorway. Well, for the love of, he began. Dad, look who's here! Jim stuck his snowshoes in front of the team and ushered Sergeant McLeish into the cabin. The family made a welcoming knot around them while the boy was introducing his big friend. And who's that? Asked the sergeant, looking over their heads towards the far corner of the room. Jim followed his glance. There, squatted on one of the beds, he saw Joe Leake's Eskimo squaw calmly nursing a tiny copper-skinned papoose.